So, once again, welcome you all on the last evening of this session on the contemporary international economics and geopolitical realignments. So, as today we are going towards the last session of our FDP, and primarily we have discussed about Russia and the Ukraine, we have discussed about Iran and Israel, we have talked about the US tariff policy. So, today I'll be taking all about India, what India's position need to be, how India will be positioning in this new global order, what will be the strategic context, how the global order shifting, and what will be the India's foreign policy, how it has been evolved, and right now it's going through a multi-alignment. Secondly, we'll discuss about the leadership, that how the India im- evolved as a global South leadership and a bridge between the West and the South-South cooperations. Next, we'll discuss about the trade diversification. So specifically, we'll be talking about the India's positioning in this new global order, where India stands, and what ways India can manage. India can try to have a, a policy which give it some positive some game, as well as provide the India to restate its position as in as in to mold the foreign policy, diversifying the trade, and play a big role as a bridge between the global south and the west. So today we will all be discussing about this all. So let me do a quick summary of what we will be discussing today. I'll just share my screen. I hope my screen is visible to everyone. I hope my screen is visible. If not, then please let me know. Is my screen visible, Puneet sir? Hello, am I audible, sir? So thank you, Neeraj sir. So I'll do a quick summary of what we are discussing today. So in determining the India's global strategic position, what how India should position in this new global order. So what we will be discussing, so we will be focusing on five major aspects. Number one, the multi-alignment strategy, that how India will be aligning with all over the countries around the world. What could be the strategic partnership, specifically with the three main powers, that is four main powers, PowerPoint, uh, PowerPoints, that is US, Russia, China, and EU, simultaneously maintaining relationships with all these nations. How will be India's playing a big role as shifting in this shifting global order, because the US China rivalry pressures other states to choose sides, supply chain shocks, climate imperatives, digital transformation which creates fluid power centers. So how India will be responding to this multi alignment, because it is not fence setting but a deliberate hedging strategy that preserves the autonomy while extracting benefits from all major blocks. Secondly, we'll be discussing about the multi-alignment foreign policy under the multi-alignment strategy, that as India practices issue-based alignment, so how it will be managing or balancing between the four nations, and their different geopolitics and their different priorities also. Thirdly, we'll be discussing about the global South leadership, that how the India's G20 presidencies and BRICS Plus expansion showed its ambition to be the norm setter for developing nations. Moreover, we'll be discussing about how the African Union and being elevated by India into the G20 and hosting the Voice of Global South Summit. So, how the India could play a big role in global South leadership, and as the leadership of the South strengthen the India's leverage with the West, which needs global South buy-in for climate and trade initiatives. So far as global South is concerned, so India could also lead in this global South cooperation with the Western nations and the torch period for the developing group of nations. Third, we will be discussing about the trade diversification and its economic impacts. So how the India have signed the 13 FTAs in last 5 years and moving ahead from protectionism to market-seeking liberalization. The economic rationale behind this trade diversification, because India still face a lot of trade deficit from China, and at last there are some constraints which need to be addressed because of logistics and infrastructural gaps. Because of that, the gains from trade has been reduced unless we have developed and we have just do some reforms on that side. Next, we will be talking about the case of economic growth trajectory, how the economic growth will be uh, uh, projected for coming 5, 10 years, 15 years, and how it would be playing a big role for the India's economy. And at last, we'll be discussing about the bridge diplomacy, that is, how India can be a bridge between the South and the West. That is, the Western forums, including G7 plus Quad, and the global South groups, including BRICS, SCO, and other nations. It also allows for the triangular cooperation between India, Japan, Africa, and the conflict mediation between Ukraine and Gaza. Secondly, India can translate the southern priorities to Western capitals and vice versa also. So, positioning itself as a broker of norms in trade, tech, governance, and UN reform. So, therefore, India could play a biggest predeterminal role in the bridging of this global South aspiration and the Western dominance participations. So, we'll start with the first aspect of our study, the first issue, that is India's multi alignment foreign policy strategy. So, what is India's multi alignment strategy? So, if we talk about this policy of multi alignment, so it's about the strategic autonomy where there is non-alignment 2.0. So it was non-alignment 1.0 last 15 years, 14, 25 years back. Now it is non-alignment 2.0. And non-alignment is like not just passive neutrality but a dynamic hedging strategy, because India need to take care not just the uh, not just being neutral to the any forces, any kind of ideologies, but it has to take steps in order to form steps in order to get the benefit out of all these issues, get the best out of each and every partner without discriminating with any of the nations, but trying to develop a relation with each and every nation. And the four major power points, that is, I have already mentioned Russia, US, China, and the European Union. So they has to balance between the developed ones and the emerging ones. It has to take a balance between the communist China and the liberalized US, the developed US and the developing part of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, that is the BRICS. So how India will be playing a role? So the non-alignment is not the neutrality, but a dynamic hedging, where India needs to secure its benefit, secure its interest, being in a agreement with each and every nation such that it can maximize its strategic benefits rather than going on a one side. So non-alignment here is not a passive neutrality but a hedging strategy. So logic behind is that by refusing exclusive blocks, India preserves a policy space, not just by going for a particular nation, not just being specific. India try to create a ground, create a space for it to have a benefit from each and every nation, so that the relations from each nations are in the strategic benefit for India. So it is all about the India preserving the policy space, which is very much critical in the world where US China rivalry forces binary choices. So, in order to go binary, India has tried to develop some space for China, some space with US, some space with Russia, and some space with other developing nations or the emerging ones. So, the outcome here could be that it enables India to pursue energy from Russia, technology from the US, trade with China, which maximize the benefits while minimizing the vulnerability to sanctions or coercion. So in order to maximize all the benefits it can have, so It maintains its relationship with Russia for energy sources, for energy imports, that oil primarily. It maintains relations with US in order to get better technologies, and maintaining the trade with China simultaneously for markets. It absolutely makes India getting all the maximum benefits out of minimizing all the vulnerabilities or the risk of being isolated from one nation's or from the strategic benefit from one particular nation's. Next, we talk about the case of the diversified partnership. When we talk about a diversified partnership, so it's kind of a portfolio management, it kind of a, risk management, because here India, what strategy is following is called the diversifying the portfolios in a manner like we do the investments. We don't keep all the eggs in one basket. So it's an old saying, don't keep all the eggs in one basket. Rather than we need to diversify our portfolio, that we keep some amount in some fund, some amount in some fund, and other amount in other fund. So we diversify our capital in different funds, and therefore we form a portfolio. So it's kind of a portfolio approach which is India following, like diversified investment we do. So India spreads its strategic ties across multiple poles from US, Russia, EU, and East Asia. So what could be the possible benefit of it? That we minimize the risk, we spread the risk all over by reducing the supplier concentration in defense, energy, and technology. Primarily, three aspects are there. So, for example, Russian arms remain vital for military readiness, while US partnership drives advanced defense R&D. So we need to depend on both. We need to have a benefit for both from both the nations. So therefore, we are following a portfolio approach, that to keep some relations with US, some relations with Russia, because we have the concentration of, because we have a lot of demand for the defense equipments, energy imports from Russia. We have a lot of demand for the advanced research and development in defense sector only from US. So we have to make a balance with both in order to get the best of the both the nations. Hence, we are if you see the trade-off among that, so it is like managing the contradictory expectations in resource intensive and sometimes the inconsistent, which remains due to this conflicts. So while buying the discounted Russian oil, while quoting the Western investors. So it is like managing between the two by doing this investment portfolio approach. So what we are actually doing here, we are maintaining the strategic relationship with US, Russia, China for different needs, and even with the European Union. So for different needs which need to be fulfilled on. Next is the come to the part of the flexible diplomacy. Now it's an adaptive tactics which we employ in order to get the best of all the strategic relationships we are having. So flexibility is both offensive as well as defensive. Offensively, it lets India seize the opportunities, like example as a mediator roles, and defensively, it cushions shocks such as sanctions or regional crisis. So how it mechanized that India reacts to the fast-moving geopolitical events, borders border skirmishes with China, changing US administrators, or EU climate regulations, and without being committed to a rigid alliances. So what is this flexible diplomacy tells us about? That we change our diplomatic roles, we change our relations, we change our strategies as depending upon how the particular nations is reacting with us. Next, we come to the aspect of the bilateral axis. What are the opportunities and what could be the possible constraints? So we are having 4 bilateral axes we are having right now, as I have mentioned already. Number 1 is US, number 2 is Russia, number 3 is China, number 4 is Europe, that is UK, EFTA, and European Union. So first of all, we discuss about US. So when we talk about US, what could be the opportunity? So what opportunities does US provide? So we are talking about the opportunities and constraints from these bilateral axes. Specifically, if we go by US, China, European Union, and Russia. So starting from United States, what could be the opportunities and what could be the constraints? So if we talk about the opportunities, it gives an access to the cutting edge defense, technology, investment flows, and the Quad cooperations on the Indo-Pacific security. Because in the Quad, these are 4 nations among which US is one of them. So Quad is a security cooperation between India, Japan, Australia, and United States of America. So it acts as a counter to the the effects of or the or on the Pacifics. So Indo-Pacific securities issue is being uh, uh, or the Indo-Pacific security being maintained or contained due to this cooperation of Quad. So in the Indo-Pacific waters, we have a partnership through Quad so that we can control the China in the Pacific waters and South China Sea also. Now the constraint due to the US is that it pressure to us to distance from Russia or align against China, which is like clashing the India's autonomy. So opportunity while having a better relations or a strategic relationship with US gives opportunities, number one in form of cutting edge technology and investment flows, and most importantly the Quad cooperation in the Indo-Pacific water supporting India. The constraint would be its pressure to cut its ties, to distance it, to isolate itself from Russia and China being the biggest rivalry right now for US. Next is the case of Russia. When we talk about the Russia, so what could be the possible opportunities for Russia is the defense equipments, cheap energy imports, space collaborations, and strategic depth on some geopolitical issues like Indo-Pak War, or Indo-Pak attacks recently in May, which we see. So Russia directly supports India in such matters. But on a constraint side, if we see what could be the possible constraint, what could be the possible challenge in having a better relations with Russia or having a dynamic relationship with Russia also, is the over dependence on the Russian arms, which risks vulnerability. Because if Moscow has or Russia has a more autonomy, a more negotiable powers with them, because we are more dependent for the arms and ammunition on Russia, so it could become vulnerable if there are Western sanctions being tightened. So this could be a possible constraint while having a relations or a constraint while having a strategic relationship with Russia. Next is the case of China. What could be the possible opportunity of having better relations with China? That it provides 125 billion trades, including electronics, capital goods, and many other things which are critical for the for as a semi-finished goods or a raw material for Indian manufacturing industries. What could be the possible constraints? So constraint that be is the primarily the border disputes and the competition in the Indian Ocean to create security dilemma, forcing costly military preparedness even as commerce grows. So the biggest problem with China right now India is facing is for the border disputes and the Indian Ocean issues on the security side. Next is the case of Europe, which includes UK, European Free Trade Area, and the European Union. So opportunity will be the high value markets, technological partnerships, which will diversify away from US and Asia. And the biggest constraint could be the EU's regulatory demands, that is, a regulatory measures and the human rights scrutiny, which will complicate the negotiations. So a lot of uh, regulatory framework, a lot of regulatory demands from EU creates a biggest constraint for India to have a better strategic relationship with EU. So these are the four cases I have already mentioned in the key bilateral axes, opportunities as well as the constraints if I talk about. So if I talk about the overall takeaways from this is number one is the strategic hedging. That is, India leverages each relationship for specific gains, technology. And what are these gains are? Please let me mention it. How India leverage these relationships for each and specific gains. Number one is technology from the US, energy and arms from Russia, market access from European Union, and manufacturing inputs from China, while avoiding any kind of strategic capture. So not being aligned specifically for towards a particular nation, India gains a lot of support and a lot of economic gains in these four sectors from different four power points. Next is the balance of risk versus autonomy. So strategy by now this is the second takeaway, that balancing the risk versus autonomy. We are not just taking a huge risk, but we are also maintaining our autonomy. So the strategy buys independence but requires constant calibration. So it's good being independent, that we are autonomous, but yes, we are also having a constant calibration, because a sudden escalation like Sino-Indian war, China-India border conflict, or severe Western sanctions on Russia could force a difficult realignments. And third is the power projection. So the multi-alignment enhances India's credibility as a bridge between or a bridge power between the global south, since it demonstrates that a large democracy can maintain sovereignty in a multipolar systems. So the power projection, balance of risk versus autonomy, and the strategic hedging, these are the three main key takeaways from this multi-alignment India's policy strategy. If you want to ask anything related to this, if you're having any questions, please let me know so that we can move to the next slide or to the next aspect which we want to discuss. And anything from your side, if you want to ask something, please. Otherwise, we'll move ahead to the next aspect, that is India's global south leadership and the voice. So I think there are no more questions. I can move ahead. So as we go to the India's global south leadership, so as India aims to be the principal voice of the developing world, and the country is often called as the global south, it is not just the symbolic. It is like controlling the narrative of global south priorities, which gives India an agenda, setting power in climate talks, trade negotiations, and the multilateral reforms. So the first move made by India was the G20 presidency. In G20 presidency in 2023, the first move India made was the inclusion of African Union. By pushing up for the EU's permanent G20 membership, India expanded the club's legitimacy and secured the gratitude from African nations. So, inclusion of the African Union into the G20 has made India a voice of Global South. Next is the Voice of Global South Summit, like gathering leaders of 120 plus developing nations to craft a common stance on energy, food security, and the debt. Because before the G20 met, India arrived with ready-made consensuses. So involving for about 120 plus developing nations and being the voice of the global south, India has strategically utilized the G20 presidency as success. Next is the case of BRICS expansion. So BRICS expansion in 2025, it enlarged the bloc over 35% of the global GDP. The nations include under the BRICS bloc are now constitute toward about for 35% of the world economy or the global GDP and nearly half of the world's population. It promoted the theme as resilience and innovation for cooperation and sustainability, and which positioned as a cooperative BRICS, not confrontational alternative to the Western-led institutions. This is need to be understood very carefully. So this theme of BRICS expansion as a resilience and innovation for cooperation and sustainability is positioning the BRICS as cooperative, not confrontation alternative to Western-led institutions. So probably as I have discussed, BRICS expansion had led to uh, uh, a, a kind of a cooperation among the developing group of nations and developing the voice of global south. So when we talk about the leverage, how the India is having a leverage with the West among this is that Western powers needed the global South for support in climate finance, supply chain security, and the trade liberalization. So India could also act as a bridge or a leverage, having a leverage with the West, because seeking about the South-South cooperation, which has enhanced the trade with Africa and Latin America, is quite visible. So by acting as a spokesperson of these nations, India can bargain for technology transfers, market access, or finance in return for bringing South on board. And probably keeping the voice of South and bridging the South with the West, India can take or bargain for a lot of gains out of being a platform for these nations in the Western dominance. Secondly, as China's Belt Road Initiative being criticized for creating debt dependency. Rather, India has a better role to play because India could be the better alternative than the China, because China's Belt Road Initiative is often being criticized for the debt dependency. Rather, India offers transparent, debt-free partnerships. So a narrative that it will create, it appeals more as compared to Beijing. And yes, it gives India a moral high ground because as compared to China, India's moral image is better because India's narrative has been transparent and the partnership which is debt free rather than debt dependency. So the bottom line is that it will strengthen its claim. Now, how India's global South leadership will be a strategic statecraft that need to be understood. That it will strengthen the India's claim to be a permanent UN Security Council seat, being the leader in the Indian global South. Secondly, it will expand the economic diplomacy with Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia's nations. And at last, it will enhance the bargaining power with advanced economies that need the global South cooperation. So India will have three aspects to claim, and it will give a strategic statecraft in a manner. Number one, it will strengthen its claim to be a permanent Security Council seat. Second, it will expand the India's economic diplomacy with Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. And lastly, it will enhance the bargaining power with advanced economies that need the global South cooperation. So India will act as a bridge between the global South and the Western economies. Now we talk about the next aspect, that is the India's trade diversification and the economic partnerships. How India's trade policy seek a structural shift. How it has changed, this we're going to discuss right now. So if we talk about the structural shift which took place in India's trade policy, that is movement from protectionism to the market-seeking behavior. So for decades, India has been following a relatively protectionist trade policy, which shields domestic industries with higher rate of tariffs. But now it is actively signing a lot of free trade agreements. As if I have mentioned, like 13 FTAs have been signed till now in order to gain wider market access. It reflects in strategic pivot towards export-led growth because India now learned that the other ways and means to increase the growth rate is the trade. Because as we have already said, and I have already mentioned in the earlier sessions also, the trade is the engine of growth. It is the trade only through which the economy's growth can go to the double digit. So it reflects a strategic pivot towards export-led growth and global supply chain integration, not just the liberalization. So it is not only about the liberalization, but it is all about the how to integrate the supply chain in order to have better exports and better trade flows. Now we come to the economic rationale of this movement from protectionism to trade integration of India's economy with all other nations by signing 13, 14 FTAs in last 5-10 years. So number one is the reducing the China's dependence. So why India? What is the economic reason behind signing these 13 FTAs and trying to have more trade agreements with most of the nations? Is reducing the China's dependence, because China remains the India's largest trading partner, but the India's trade deficit with China is about $85 billion. So India has to reduce its trade dependence on China, and therefore it need to have signed a lot of trade agreements, diversifying its trade to other nations. Overall reliance on Chinese components like electronics, machinery, chemicals, it creates a supply chain risk, it creates a supply chain vulnerability, and weakens our bargaining power too. So to diversify, to find an alternative to the Chinese goods, we have to go for these types of FTAs and signing of documents. So our trade is being diversified. Second rationale is the new partners to balance out. As I have already mentioned, we have to find an alternative to China-centric arrangements. Therefore, we need to find a balance. And for that balance, we have to find new partners for trade. So for that, FTAs with UAE, as I have already mentioned, like UAE CEPA, bilateral trade with a target of $100 billion by 2030. FTA with UK, right? Recently, India had a FTA with UK. Next, the FTA with Australia, EFTA, that is European Free Trade Area, and some negotiations with EU, US, and Eurasian Union. So it will diversify both the markets and the sources of critical inputs. So we are not have only the China to our sole provider of the critical inputs, but we can diversify our imports from many other nations. And this is how we can spread the risk and create a leverage so that India can source technology or capital goods from multiple suppliers instead of one dominant country. So reduce our dependence from China through these FTAs and these trade agreements. We can enhance or we can reduce the risk of being vulnerable to a particular nation. Next. Next is the economic dimension, that is the geopolitical leverage, if we talk about. So trade deals are not just a commercial, they are a strategic alignment like UAE CEPA strengthens the IMEC corridor. As I have already mentioned yesterday, IMEC, India, Middle East, Asian, European corridor. So it acts as a bridge between India, Middle East, and the European nations. I'll explain about IMEC in detail whenever we come to that point. I have already kept that in another PPT. But it acts as a bridge. So these trade deals are not just commercial supports, but they act as alignment because it strengthens the many of our projects. Specifically, as I mentioned, this UAE CEPA agreement is strengthening the IMEC project. Secondly, the Australia ECTA deepens the Indo-Pacific partnership because our partnership in the Indo-Pacific in the Pacific is only with Australia and Japan, except US also. Thirdly, these trade networks enhance India's role, then again as a bridge between global South and the West. Now, what are the constraints? What are the execution risks? What are the infrastructural bottlenecks in implementing these types of partnerships and economic partnerships? What challenges does India will be facing? So number one is the infrastructure bottlenecks because we are having poor port logistics, limited cold chain capacity, and high transportation inland transportation cost. So which erase these or reduce the tariff advantages which we gain from these FTAs. So we have to do a lot of work on our infrastructural bottlenecks in a form of logistics, supply chain capacity, and the inland transportation costs. Because the projects like IMEC, India, Middle East to European corridor, and other connectivity upgrades materialize on schedule, but the potential benefits still are on paper. So we have to work a lot of reforms in order to materialize these corridors to get a lot of benefit out of these because we have to work on logistics, cold chain capacity, and the transportation cost. Next is the implementation gap. Signing an FTA is not the only thing through which we can get the benefit. It is only the first step. Rather, effective use of demands regulatory reforms, custom efficiency, and domestic supply side competitiveness are the areas where the progress is somewhat uncertain and uneven. So these three areas need to be worked upon. Hence, how India can drive the FTA into an economic benefit is a calculated effort to dilute the Chinese dominance, but embed itself with the multiple trade architectures and leverage for geopolitical influence. So these are the three takeaways from the India's trade diversification and the economic partnerships. Next, we come to the last part, that is India, Middle East, Europe corridor, IMEC. I have already mentioned. So first of all, we need to see what is IMEC, what is the root of IMEC. So IMEC is a multimodal connectivity. What do you mean by multimodal connectivity? Because it includes ports, railway roads, pipelines from India to Europe. So I just want to show you how the IMEC is being on the geography. So through a map, I just want to display. So it is a multimodal connection or multimodal transportation connecting Mumbai till Greece, that is the European nation. So it connects Mumbai ports through UAE port through a sea route. Then from UAE, Jebel Ali port till many of the ports in the United Arab Emirates, that is Al Ghafit, Riyadh, then at Al Haditha, and then it connects with Israel through a rail route. So from Mumbai to UAE, it's a sea route. Then from among the UAE, it is as a rail route till Israel.
and then again from Israel it becomes a sea route till Greece. So it connects our Arabian Gulf to India, and in the northern corridor, it connects the Arabian Gulf to the Europe. So through a sea route, it is connected with India in the Arabian Gulf, and through a rail route, it is connected with the among within the Arabian Gulf, and from the Arabian Gulf to Europe, it is connected with, once again with the sea route. So it has two separate corridors. One is the East Corridor, which connects India with the Arabian Gulf, and a northern corridor which connects Arabian Gulf to the Europe. So it gives us a way through which we can connect our ports with the Middle East and as well as the European nation. So how it will be affecting the India's economy, how it will be reducing the cost, that we can discuss right now. So far as IMEC is concerned, there is an expectation that it will reduce the cost of logistics by 30%, and it will reduce the time by 40% as compared to the Suez Canal movement of goods and services. It will also be an alternative, best alternative to the China's BRI, that is Belt Road Initiative in the European nations, and it will working as a partnership framework between India, UAE, Saudi Arabia, EU, and the US. The economic benefits and the energy benefits are as follows: like energy security, we will be getting the access to the Middle East, renewable energy and green hydrogen, better digital infrastructure, trade enhancement to the Europe, faster access to, as we are getting faster access to the European exports, and also the FDI attraction, that is major infrastructure investment opportunities in the logistics. So we will get a lot of benefit out of this belt, out of the IMEC being the alternative towards the Belt Road Initiative, as a counter to the Belt Road Initiative of China, because it reduces the cost by 40% in form of time saving and 30% in form of the logistics. So it is beyond the economic benefits. It reorders the regional geopolitics, binding India, Gulf states, Europe, and the US into the counterweight to the Beijing's Eurasian projects, that is Belt Road Initiative. Now we come to the next part, that is the Quad partnership. So when we talk about the Quad is the biggest strategic framework because it balances our uh, confrontation with the China by having a security cooperation in the Indo-Pacific area with Australia, China, sorry, Australia, Japan, and US. So it protects the India as an autonomy in the Indo-Pacific waters, and it's a kind of counterweight with a parallel participation with SCO BRICS with developing nations. So it's kind of balancing strategy for India to maintain the relationship between the Quad, and again acting as a balance between the global South and the Western economies. Next is the come to the part of Act East policy and the regional connectivity. So this is very important aspect I want to discuss today. So the Act East policy. So just going by the very summarized form because we are running out of time now. So India is now moving from look east to act east. So what was the look east policy? That from 1990s to 2014, the look east policy was there. So look east policy was a background of this policy is the east policy, India's East Asian policy. So the look east, so the movement from look east to act east, how it has evolved. So look east policy was only about the trade liberalization. It was an economic engagement with Southeast Asia after the India's 1991 economic reforms. It usually focused on trade liberalization, Asian partnerships, investment flows, and cultural links. The logic behind that look east policy was to integrate the India with fast growing Asian tiger economies and reduce the over dependence on the Western market. So this was all about the background of look east policy. Now the transition from look east to act east from 2014 onwards, what it could have been. So it's an analytical shift
from passive outreach, like looking, to proactive implementation, that is acting. So looking means passive outreach. And now from look east to act east means proactively implementing the Eastern strategic benefits. So the dimensions are not just the economic cooperation, rather security and strategic cooperations, maritime security, defense exercises, and counterterrorism. Secondly, the connectivity projects like road, rail projects and linking India to Southeast and the East Asia. Thirdly, the people to people and digital integration through education, culture, and technology. So this is the movement from Act East to Look East. Sorry, Look East to Act East policy. Now we talk about the drivers of these change. So the four C's, if we talk about culture, commerce, connectivity, and capacity building. So the rise of China's assertiveness in the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean is the reason by which India has to go from look east to act east, so as to develop its uh, relations with East Asian nations. And this assertiveness of China in South China Sea made India to go for act east policy. Now, what could be the economic imperatives that need to diversify markets and supply chain beyond China, not just confined towards China, and the potential of ASEAN as a 3 trillion consumer market. This also gives a reason for this change from look east to act east policy. So these are four C framework I have already mentioned: culture, commerce, connectivity, capacity building. Some flagship projects including India, Myanmar, Thailand trilateral highway, Paladan multimodal transit, Act East Forum with Japan, 1 billion credit line for Asian digital infrastructure, Asian Indian Summit, East Asia Summit, BIMSTEC, and Quad Cooperation. So these are the few policy instruments through which we are using as a movement from look east to act east. What will be the strategic payoff by connecting to East Asian nations? So India's Asian trade, India and Association of Southeast Asian Nations, grew from $2 billion to $130 billion right now. Greater naval presence and defense partnerships helps balancing China's influence in the South China Sea. So to counterbalance the China's influence, it gives India a better advantage by connecting with East Asian nations. So, and the politically, if I say the position India as a key stakeholder in the Indo-Pacific architecture strengthened its multi-alignment strategy. Now we come to the next aspect, that is the digital diplomacy and the technological leadership. So, how the digital technology plays a bigger part in the foreign diplomacy. So, India treats its domestic digital public infrastructure, that is DPI, which includes UPI, Aadhaar, digital locker, and they are as an exportable public goods, not just national tools. So, by offering these platforms to other countries, India creates a technology-based fair influence. Sorry. So, by offering these types of platforms like UPI, Aadhaar, digital ID, DigiLocker, and such units, such public goods, India offered these platforms to other countries, which creates a technology-based sphere of influence that goes beyond traditional trade or military power, because it works as a sphere of influence. And this sphere of influence is a very important concept if I talk about the Russia-Ukraine war. This Russia-Ukraine war actually started on the basis of this sphere of influence, but today I am not having so much time to discuss that matter. We will discuss in some other FDP on that, how the sphere of influence works as the biggest diplomacy in geopolitics. Next, the mechanisms of influence. So when a country builds its payments or ID systems on India's tax standards, it relies on Indian technical support, upgrades, and governance advice. And this creates a long-term institutional link similar to how a dollar-based finance ties economies to the US. So please need to understand. So how India is setting a norm through these digital payments, these stack payments, these standards, and it is creating an institutional links on how the many of the nations will be depending. So when a country builds its payments or ID systems on India's stack standards, it made them rely on Indian technical support, and this gives India a comparative advantage and makes the mechanism of influence. So India shapes data privacy, interoperability, and open source standards, which gives it a voice in global tech governance areas which are often dominated by US and Chinese firms. So it's given India a strategic advantage
because as against China's surveillance, which is heavily digital exports, Western proprietary platforms, India offers an open source, low cost model of technology. This appeals to the developing nations that want digital infrastructure without ceding sovereignty or paying steep licensing fees. So it gives an India a strategic advantage in the soft power also. So the countries using UPI or Aadhaar-like systems naturally look to India for upgrades, expertise, and the policy guidance, which deepen the goodwill as well as the diplomatic leverage. So this is all from my side today. I have a lot more things to discuss, but now the time is running short. Thank you so much. I've tried to capture as much as possible I can, though I am left with a lot more contents to discuss on. But now I have to open the house for the questions. Any question from anyone, please let me know. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Today is the last day, or tomorrow is also we have,
No, so today is the last day.
and certificate will be generated automatically, sir.
Yeah,
I
that
will be informing about all the
Puneet sir,
certificates once we conclude the session for it. All the session is now open for questions. Please feel free to ask your questions, post them in the chat box. Last call for questions, if any.